All right, welcome to the show. My name is Robin, and as always, together with my partner in crime, Kevin. Today, we're joined by Steve. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hey,
Steve,
sorry, go on,
Steve,
Robin.
sorry, what? All
Hey,
right, man.
can I say one thing? That intro video was awesome. I felt like I was getting ready to watch Terminator 2 or something.
Yeah.
Like,
Thanks,
nice
man.
work on that.
All right, so let's get the ball rolling. Steve, can you introduce yourself for everyone who doesn't know you yet?
Yeah, so I'm a principal program manager with Microsoft, and I work on a team where we focus on improving Azure. And my focus in that bubble is on Kubernetes. So all things containers on Azure. And prior to Microsoft, I was with Avanade and Accenture. So I was working with Fortune 500 clients all over the place, helping them deploy, design, architect, Azure solutions, everything from SAP on Azure to just pure like Azure migrations. And of course, my favorite topic, AKS and container foundations.
Nice.
Wow, it's pretty impressive. I'm just looking at your background on here, Steve. So you were an MVP for 10 years running before you came to Microsoft, obviously, right?
Yes.
What I like about your scenario and background is the real world scenarios that you have worked in, right? Especially around recently AKS and Kubernetes, right? But I always find that speaks volumes when we're speaking to our customers or the community, right? Is having that real life experience of applying those validated scenarios, right, and configurations to our infrastructure. So I'm pretty blown away with your back catalog of achievements here. Like, you're a Pluralsight author. Where else? You're a board member of the Minnesota Azure user group as well.
Yeah.
And, you speak at conferences all over the place, right? So.
Yep. Yeah. Author. You can probably see couple of the books behind me here. So I got let me see here. That's the first one. I don't know if you can see it down here. You can see my neighbor's houses in the background, but this is the AKS book I did with Ned, Ned and other co-authors. So yeah, I've authored like 8 books, Pluralsight, 19 courses and counting. So you can find courses out there on my Pluralsight portfolio around Kubernetes, things like Argo CD, GitOps, and other stuff as well. So I try to do a lot to share with the community and just, contribute.
You're going to be giving Robin ideas after this. He'll be thinking, how can I offer a book?
I've been juggling like different responsibilities, and I don't even have kids, right? So I'm in my second course with LinkedIn Learning, and
nice,
man,
congrats.
what a work, man. It's after this, I need some form of sabbatical after that, because it's just a lot of work, and at the same time, my day-to-day job as an architect picked up, and everything came together. We still have our live streams now. I'm reviewing another book, and I'm really enthusiastic about what I do, and I expected you have the same enthusiasm and passion for what you do, if I'm right.
Definitely. And I think a lot of people look at the stuff that I've done and they're like, whoa. And I don't know if people remember, like, this is over the span of many years, right? So it's not like, oh, all this stuff in one summer. No, this is like built up over years, right? Like Pluralsight, I've been authoring with them for like 3.5 years, I think it is. So it's, there's a lot of work. It takes time to kind of do everything that I've done. But one of my passions is, get the knowledge out of my head and share it with the tech community and help wherever I can.
Yeah, this deserves an applause round, because
love the sound effects.
Literally trailblazing away. Hardest worker in the room is probably an understatement right there, Steve. But I'm glad you shared that story, because we're big on keeping things real, if that makes sense. Like, and people think success is made overnight, but actually, like you said, it takes years of hard work, right? So
exactly. Yep.
no shortcuts. So
no shortcuts. You got to, you put in the work, and before you know it, you're like, where'd all that time go? And look at all this stuff.
That's awesome, man.
Cool. All right.
So we've got an agenda today. I'm really keen on this because this is a bit of a minefield's not the right term, right? But as we know, as soon as you open the Kubernetes door, it goes down several levels, right? Before you actually get to the piece of information that you want, right? Or trying to understand it. So today we're going to look at architecture design, which is obviously very big. We're going to look at the deployment stage as well. So we've talked about this on the show previously. So stuff like the landing zone accelerator, the construction helper, baseline automation, and then water and feeding our platform as well, right? Our workload, so the operations side of it. So I like the fact that you've split this up into categories as well, Steve, right? To make it more palatable for people to consume, because as I said before, this subject, it's in its own nature just becomes complex just by even talking about it, right? So we have tried to break it down, right, Robin? We've had several people on the show and stuff like that, but I've got a good feeling about how this is going to play out, right? Especially for people that are just starting off with this or looking to run those production workloads, right, in Azure. So should we kick off with architecture design?
Yeah, sounds good. And if I could take a step back, just for those that are listening. So last year in August, I wrote a blog, and the blog is a guide to navigating the AKS enterprise documentation and scripts. And so one of the biggest problems that I experienced when I was still at Accenture and Avanade working in the field with clients is when they wanted to get started with AKS, it's like, where do I start? And then you go out to the documentation and there's so much, right? Clients would struggle, like, do I go dive real deep into Kubernetes itself and go into the Kubernetes documentation, which is phenomenal documentation, by the way. So if you're learning Kubernetes, like, yes, dive in there. Microsoft has some really good documentation too for learning K8s, as well as on learn.microsoft.com. But when you're engaging on a project, like, maybe Kubernetes, maybe you have some folks that know Kubernetes on the team now, and it's like, okay, we feel good with this. We've been doing it in labs. We've done some training. We have some workloads. We want to containerize, or we have future plans, or we got this microservice application. We want to move it to AKS. Where do I start? And so the idea was, like, I put together this guide in this blog post to help folks be able to navigate, right? And then at Microsoft, we have some really great tools that can help deploy your AKS, generate templates, as well as deploy your application, right? But again, it's like it's like navigating a minefield, Kevin, like you stated, right? It can be really intimidating. And so I just sort of pulled that together in an organized way so someone could read through it and follow along, and utilize the tools and navigate the documentation. And the documentation is set up in a way too, where, like, if you're doing AKS vanilla and you're not really looking at security right now, or let's say you have a part of your cloud or your data center where, you don't have any PCI compliance, you don't have any other compliance that you need to meet. Maybe it's all internal. And so you could use the vanilla architecture guidance for that. But what happens if you need to have PCI compliant AKS clusters, or you want to deploy your AKS cluster as private, right? Then you need to navigate the documentation in a certain way and kind of drill down a couple levels deeper to find that stuff to help you with it. And at Microsoft, we have that documentation out there, but it's not always easy to find. Now, I will say there's an effort that's ongoing to kind of clean up the documentation, organize it, and make it better and easier. him and his team for kind of doing that work. But that's where this blog came out of. It was like, how can I put something together that people can use to navigate all of this stuff, right? I get this mental picture of like going into a rack or a data center, and there's a rack and there's all these wires and it's a rat's nest, right? It's like, just close the door and leave, right? Like I'm not even touching that as long as it works, right? The documentation can kind of feel like that when you're trying to navigate it. And so I broke it down into 3 areas. And this was when I broke it down, I organized it in the way that we approached projects with clients, right? So you go in and you start to design the architecture. You're meeting with different teams, security, networking. You're meeting with the server folks. If they have a container team, maybe a cloud, a circle of excellence cloud team, right? You're meeting with all these different teams. You're gathering inputs. You're designing, and you're building around what they already have from a standards and policies perspective. But then when you throw AKS into the mix, there's a lot of standards and policies that they haven't thought of, right? And it's this new thing. So you start with that design, you build out the architecture, and then after that, it's like, okay, what's next, right? Well, deploying it. And yeah, you could go into the portal, you could click deploy, and you could do that X amount of times for your clusters, but it's not really efficient. And so 99% of the time, we were building out Terraform scripts for the AKS clusters that included all of the aspects that we decided on in the design. And so now you have these Terraform scripts, you throw them in something like Azure DevOps, and now you could deploy clusters over and over and over, right? That meet the organization standards. And then after that, like, okay, we have these clusters deployed. What's next? Well, you need to operate it. That's when you get into day 2 and day 3 and et cetera, et cetera. I didn't do a ton of work in that area because I was in the consulting space, but definitely did some. But again, the Microsoft documentation can help you with each of those 3 areas. And there are tools that come into those areas. I'll dive into one more thing and then I'll shut up and I'll turn it back over to you, Kevin and Robin. But so when you're designing, Microsoft has like the AKS landing zone and the AKS security baseline. So you can go through that and start to use that as a checklist, right? And then when you get into the deployment, there's a tool called the AKS construction helper. You could go through that and it's basically like wizard driven, and you set your configurations that you want for your AKS clusters. Even everything from like private clusters, you could add things like I want Prometheus monitoring, or I want an ingress controller like app gateway ingress controller, or maybe I'm doing Nginx. And even if you're doing service mesh, there's options in there to turn that on. So when you've configured it through the wizard, now you can grab the code that it generates for you, and you can use that to go deploy your clusters. And it generates ARM templates, Terraform code, Azure CLI, and you can use any of that. And you can take that and go throw that up in your repo. And then one more tool that I want to talk about is Azure Draft. And so if you have applications that you need to containerize, you can use Azure Draft to help with that. And it'll create the Kubernetes files that you need to run your app on an AKS cluster as well. So it'll generate like the Kubernetes manifest files or the Helm charts, and it'll actually stick all of that in GitHub Actions and deploy it for you. So, I mean, the tooling is all there. The documentation is all there for guidance. It's just like, how do we take these Lego pieces and put them together, right? And actually go use it. So I'll turn it back over to you, Kevin. I just wanted to level set for folks that are listening to kind of give them an overview of what we're talking about.
No, this is great. I seem to have this conversation on a daily basis, Steve, so this is quite familiar to me, right? But this is like a continuation of like that cloud adoption framework, that Azure landing zone sort of mythology, right? But we're taking it one step further with our workload, which is AKS, right? And I like the way that, you know, you break it down into, you know, the governance model, or am I just getting started? How does it look? But then you mentioned Azure Draft, right? So are you able to divulge a little bit more on Azure Draft? I mean, it sounds like it's like a, well, here's the tools, right? You bring the app, right, kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, definitely. So in regards to AKS, so you brought up the CAF, right? Cloud Adoption Framework, which is guidance from Microsoft, right? It's free to any customer. And that guides you on your infrastructure and your architecture in Azure all up. And if we're being real here, you're not just going to go deploy an AKS cluster if you don't have your Azure architecture done right. Like, you actually start with the Azure architecture first. You get that figured out, and then you do your AKS clusters. If you don't start there, you end up having to redo stuff later on. And so the CAF is a great tool that you want to dive into and use that as a ancillary tool to what you're doing with AKS. And then with the AKS landing zone and security baseline, they really, like the teams at Microsoft, hacked onto the CAF and really, I don't know what the right term is, customized it for AKS, if you will. And some of the things you need to think about with AKS are like your identity and access management, networking, critical one. That's critical
deep,
to cloud as well.
Deep subject, right?
Yes.
Networking.
You will spend time on that. Governance, your security, and then your management and operations. Are you going to monitor your AKS clusters? You probably are, because you need to make sure they're running, right? Are you going to monitor the workloads? And then the automation and DevOps. So, and when we talk about that, there's automating the AKS clusters themselves, like the architecture, the infrastructure there. And you could just do that straight up with Terraform or whatever tool, right? There's tons of tools out there to help you with that. Or you could use something like GitOps. And maybe we'll get into that later. But then you also have the automation and DevOps on the application side of things, right? And so that's something to think about too. And so the things that I just mentioned are core to the AKS architecture itself. And in addition to those core areas, you have your applications and your data. And the applications cross that automation and DevOps piece. And that's where we get into like Azure Draft. And Azure Draft is an open source tool for Microsoft. So any customers can go and use it. And again, like I mentioned already, basically you have your application code in a repository. You point Azure Draft at that, you tell it go, and it will containerize it. And it actually detects the language too. So if it's JavaScript, if you got a Python app, if you got, I don't know, Java or something else, it's going to detect the language. And then what it does is it creates the Docker file for you. And then you have to have a Azure Container Registry, and you input that data into, or that information for ACR into Draft, and it will actually push that Docker image up to that ACR. And then it's going to ask you what kind of deployment do you want to do to your Kubernetes cluster, right? And so you could choose from Kubernetes manifest file, you could choose from a Helm chart, or you can even do customize if you're working with customize. And then when you do that, when you tell it what you're going to use, it'll actually generate the files for that with the information from ACR, your container image. So it pulls in your ports and like all the stuff you already did earlier in the process. It pulls that all in. So let's say we choose Kubernetes manifest files. So it's going to generate those YAML files for you. And then if you hooked it up to your GitHub, it will create a GitHub action that puts the mechanism in place to deploy the Kubernetes manifest file to your AKS cluster. And so it's going to ask you for, GitHub account, your AKS cluster, resource group, all that good stuff, your ACR. and then it lays that all out in a GitHub action. And so what it does is it will actually reach out to ACR, pull the image down as a part of your Kubernetes manifest file, and then deploy that to your AKS cluster. And so there's a little bit of walking through the wizard-like experience, right? Which is all command line. And by the way, there are teams that are working on some stuff. Actually, there's a public preview out right now where Azure Draft is in VS Code. And there's an awesome team that's working on that. I really can't say much more about that, but I've written some blogs about Azure Draft. You can go read it and just keep an eye out on what's coming with Azure Draft. But so the tooling there is going to get better and better and better to make it easier for you to containerize your application, get it ready for Kubernetes, and then get that thing deployed to AKS. It's really cool stuff.
It feels a little bit like a cloud center of excellence or like a platform engineering kind of approach by Microsoft for AKS, right? You have your reference architectures, you have your modules that are reusable that you can construct using the AKS construction helper, weave in what you want. There are baselines. There is even a way for you to help you to deploy your apps with Azure Draft, right? So if you look at all these things, that's what usually a cloud center of excellence or a platform team is trying to deliver to their developers, right, in the form of enablement. So this is basically that. That's how it feels to me with everything that's taken care of.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And if you have a circle of excellence or a Kubernetes admin team or something, you can use the documentation out there from Microsoft to help you shape your program. And or if you're building a platform, you can use it to help you shape your platform as well. You could take it a step further, right? You could use something like Rancher, right? Where Rancher has like a service catalog, and you can use Rancher with AKS. And so you could use that functionality of Rancher, kind of that service catalog, and you could use the Microsoft guidance and tooling to help you frame up and shape your AKS in your environment, your standards, your policies, all that good stuff. And then use something like Rancher kind of as that front end. So
like self-service, like a self-service portal that ties into your cluster that people can use to deploy and take care of stuff related to that Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah. And you could take it a step further too. You could use like Azure policy for Kubernetes for, things like compliance and making sure your clusters adhere to your standards. You could also use GitOps for, your configuration management of your Kubernetes clusters and your applications. And we actually have some documentation out there and guidance and even code within the AKS automation baseline to help you with that GitOps aspect. You could use Flux, which is a GitOps operator. It's baked right into Azure as a part of AKS, or even Azure Arc Kubernetes. Or you could even use Argo CD if you're leaning that way and want to use that. You can start to pull these tools together to build out a platform. So yeah, that's spot on.
That's really impressive. Right? So what is one of the biggest challenges that you experience when working with these bigger enterprise customers and their Kubernetes initiative?
Networking.
It's always networking.
It's always networking.
Always networking.
Just start there, and a lot of times we get stuck there, right? You got to figure out the networking. You got to figure out the networking on Azure itself. That's a task in itself. And then you got to figure out the networking with AKS. Now you can go with like KubeNet, right, for your networking model with AKS, or you could go with like a CNI, like Azure CNI. Now, when that conversation would come up, the next discussion always was like, well, if I use Azure CNI, which looks great, sounds great, has all these integrations to the Azure networking. Am I going to run out of IPs? Because it looks like I'm going to run out of IPs, right? So that was always a big issue. And we were always having to, either allocate way more IPs, or some organizations, especially in that Fortune 500, they had a set of IPs or blocks of IPs that they could use, and that was it. It was like, we're talking about these massive organizations, right, that have a whole nother networking team where they carve out the IP, schema, and they assign, and like, that's it. And they're very protective of the amount of IPs because they don't want to run out. And so Kubernetes admins would often struggle with that. Like, this is all we have, so we got to go with KubeNet. The thing with KubeNet, there's nothing wrong with it, but there's just more work, right? Now you got to set up the routing between the pods in the AKS cluster and your resources on Azure, on the Azure layer from a networking perspective. But at Microsoft, we recently released, and I think it's still in public preview, Azure CNI overlay. And so it gives you like these overlay networks. So you can use Azure CNI and not worry about running out of IPs, because you can use like different ranges and stuff. I blogged about that too as soon as it came out, because I was super excited, because this is a big problem that I always saw day to day with customers, right? And it was like, yes, finally, this is out here. This is absolutely needed. So shout out to the AKS product group for coming out with that. But yeah, to go back to your original question, Robin, like the number one thing was like networking, and then maybe like security after that. And then after that, it would be like, okay, so how are we going to roll out multiple clusters and make sure they meet our standards? And so with that aspect, I've seen a lot of stuff, right? Every shop was different. They took a slightly different approach. Some shops would build out either ARM templates or Terraform scripts, and then they'd say, you got to come to our repo, deploy from here. We have these different modules. So if you need an ingress controller or this other thing or service mesh or whatever it might be, key vaults integration, now you use this module when you're deploying. And they'd give application teams and application owners the ability to deploy their own clusters and kind of manage it from there, making sure that it adhered to the organization standards. The other way that I saw somewhat frequently was like a Kubernetes admin team, or you could call it a circle of excellence. And they would actually deploy the clusters, and they were using infrastructure as code, but they would deploy them and then they would turn it over to like an application team to manage and do the day-to-day operations. And so customers were always asking, like, what's the best practice? What should we be doing here? What are other customers doing? Like, what's the right way to do this? And to be honest, there wasn't a single answer, because everyone did it slightly different. And so it'd be good to see like a standard come out around that, and some integration, or the heavy use of like GitOps to help facilitate that aspect. And I think fleet management, which is still fairly young in its maturity, but I think fleet management may end up being the answer there for that third, common ask.
So I heard about fleet management before, right? So what does that bring to the table exactly?
Yeah, so essentially at a high level, it's just the ability to manage like tons of Kubernetes clusters in a standardized way. And so we're seeing some tools out there for that. We're seeing some functionality. You'll even see some organizations doing some form of fleet management. So like with Rancher, I brought that up. They have some fleet management functionality. I haven't used it. I haven't dove too deep into it, but I know they have it, and they're using that. Like GitOps powers their fleet management. I know we have some stuff out there on fleet management, and I'm sure as we mature around our fleet management capabilities, you'll see that rolled into the AKS documentation more and more. But it's still like relatively new, and I think it's an open space. The other thing I'm noticing and hearing more and more about is platform engineering. And so creating a platform and more of that self-service for developers or anyone that needs to use AKS. And so maybe fleet management will power that on the back end. Maybe fleet management and platform engineering will go head to head. Not really sure there. I think the story is still being written around those aspects. The one thing we know for sure is this is a challenge, right, for large organizations that have many Kubernetes clusters.
It is a challenge that we're dealing with at the customer that I'm currently working for, right? And I'm leading the platform engineering team, and we're managing like loads of clusters on two different clouds as well. One of them being Azure.
That's
and we
another
deal with,
aspect is that multi-cloud.
Yeah, we haven't got into that completely yet. What we do reuse is our way of working. Use Azure DevOps. Use a layered approach. We use GitOps, Flux in this case.
Nice.
Right, and we write from one repository to another, and that repository is being monitored by Flux, and that's pulling in like the manifest files that we produce with Terraform and templates, right, that are being generated with Terraform. So it's a pretty nifty solution that works pretty well, but it's still quite a lot of work, and it's not as stable as you would like to be, like it to be, right? And next to that, we're also enabling teams using pipelines, and we build the pipelines for them, and they deploy the applications on top of that. But even though everything is standardized, it's still, a lot of work. You're like, okay, we got this covered, everything's automated. Then the next day something happens, and you're like, oh, we didn't cover that edge case, right? So, and then you have to go in and it's still evolving, like you just said, right? It's a really interesting space, and tools like GitOps are really powerful. So I'm really looking forward to what Fleet Manager is going to bring to the table.
Yeah. So I see teams like yours that are doing it, and it sounds like it's a bit of patchwork, right? So multiple tools, you're figuring it out. But I think teams like yours from all these different companies will start to set the standards and the best practices around like, how do we do this? What worked well for us? What didn't work well for others? And that's where, stuff like this streaming platform, user groups, conferences, all of those things are important and critical. Blogs, like you sharing what you do might help another Kubernetes team, right, out there that's struggling or about to approach this. And so, they might have heard some of the things that your team is doing, and now they can go explore that. But yeah, that's why tech community is so important, and that we share.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah, definitely. And that's what you've been doing for over more than 10 years, right? And consistently, I'm still wrapping my head around that. Like, geez, how did he do that? Right? 20 courses almost and stuff. Anyway, we're drifting here, but it's
just as a FYI, I really started on that journey in 2007. And
wow.
I was ripping some of my hair out working with OCS 2007. If anyone remembers that product, it's now what Teams or it was OCS and then became Link and became Skype for a while, and but OCS with all the certificates and stuff. I mean, it was painful, and so I was tasked with migrating us from LCS 2005, which was to OCS 2007. And the only way I made it through that was through other people's blogs, forums, right? Forum threads, stuff like that. Other people working with those products and going through that process. And there were still some gaps. And what I realized going through that experience is like, where would I be if, Joe Smith didn't share his experience, or Jane didn't share her experience, right, on a blog or a forum thread? Like, I'd be, this would have taken me like 3 times as long, right, running up against all these errors and having to troubleshoot. And so that made me realize, like, I need to share and give back and contribute.
No, we're big advocates of that. We've even launched a community, Steve, for that purpose alone, right? So
Nice.
yeah, we're very big on that. We don't like gatekeepers, right? So like you said, like, how many times have you Googled, right, and you've found that blog, and it's given you that golden line, right, of code that's made it all work together, right? Or like you said, back in the day, like when you were doing those migrations, I mean, it was still in its infancy, right? People sharing knowledge on the internet and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, kudos to those folks right out there that are always putting that information, always sharing that knowledge. So
yeah, definitely. And kudos to Microsoft. I remember the days where Microsoft was not embracing open source.
Yes.
Right. So kudos to Microsoft around really embracing open source. And even things like the AKS team puts the roadmap out there on GitHub, so anyone can go look at the roadmap, join the community call, and interact. It's really cool to kind of see that shift.
We've seen that with a lot of the tools that we develop as well. I'm seeing a more shift to, I don't know, like community accountability as well. So it's, our interaction piece, especially with the open source initiatives. It's a complete game changer from what, like you said, in the early 2000s to where we are now. It's day and night, really. So
yeah, definitely.
Cool.
All right, we have a question from Mark.
Let's go.
So Mark is asking if you couldn't set up more of a service catalog offering for enterprise. Is that something that maybe has been developed?
Yeah, I don't know if that's the Mark Godfrey I know, but if it is, hey Mark, how's it going? Thanks for the question. Yeah, so actually you can set up a service catalog offering for enterprise. I mean, there's lots of tooling out there to kind of help with that. One I think of is ServiceNow. Now, it's been a while since I worked with ServiceNow, so I know they have service catalog. I don't know if they directly integrate with like AKS. Hey, it is Mark.
It's the Mark.
We'll have to catch up soon, Mark. So, you could use something like that. I know that ServiceNow integrates with Azure, so I'm sure it could be done with enough time, enough budget, enough brains on building that. Or you could use something like Rancher, right? I mentioned that earlier. They have a service catalog in their product, and it's geared for basically taking your Helm charts and putting them out there. So you have that service catalog so you can deploy. Oh, there's Brian Caldwell. Wow, this is like a reunion right now. Brian, what's up? How's it going?
Hey, Brian.
But yeah, so you could take, like with Rancher's functionality, right? They have a service catalog and it's geared for Kubernetes environments. You can use it with AKS. You can actually use it with GKE, EKS, or if you rolled your own Kubernetes clusters, it really supports any of those. Of course, I'm going to recommend you use it with AKS. But yeah, so you could do the service catalog thing. And like I said before, when I worked with a lot of clients, that was probably the third top ask, right? It was like, how do we streamline this? How do we make this easier for our teams to use AKS? How do we make this easier for them to either deploy applications we might have in a catalog on AKS clusters, or how can we make it easier so they can take bring their applications to AKS? All right. And a lot of what I saw was, and maybe this is not the right terminology, but like poor man's service catalog. So like the idea was being kicked around a lot around like using inner source, right? So literally just like building out Terraform scripts or ARM templates or what have you for an application, for deploying that, for all the pieces that are needed for that, and then putting that out there in a Git repository, call it inner source, and make it available to teams, right? So if you're an application owner or someone that needs to deploy something, you go grab that from inner source and go deploy that on that cluster. So yeah, there's many ways to kind of do the service catalog for enterprise. Now I think platform engineering is the direction that the industry is moving to solve that problem. That and maybe fleet management.
Yeah, we're looking at something called Backstage.io. It's like a developer catalog that you can spin up and that you can then tie into different components. But there is always some automation in the backend that needs to take care of that, right? If you want something, you push that button, and something needs to happen to make it so, right?
Nice. I will be checking that out.
I think it's developed by Spotify or something, but it's quite quite interesting. I mean, I looked at it once and we discussed it, but we haven't really got into it yet. But it's quite interesting.
Nice.
Let's see, Mark. Mark says I had set something up like that back when I was with ACN. I have not seen it catch up yet. A couple called Gruntworks, a similar stuff set up, but for AWS only. All right.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of Gruntworks several times. I never worked with that, but I heard of it quite a bit. Very cool, Mark.
It's called Backstage, Mark. Backstage.io. It's like a developer portal, and it includes a service catalog and stuff like that. It seems to be really interesting. All right. While we're having this conversation, I was thinking about, okay, what are the minimal things that you would want when you deploy like a cluster, right? I think that would be a private cluster, Bastion host, application gateway with a web application firewall, maybe an Azure firewall to control your egress, and so on and so forth. So what am I missing here?
Yeah, so I would say you got to figure out your identity and access management. So you got to figure out RBAC. Maybe you integrate with Azure Active Directory, or you could use RBAC within the Kubernetes cluster itself. I would put namespaces in that pool of things you need to kind of figure out, and namespaces they're not for security, but it's more of a logical way of carving things up. But it's really good to utilize namespaces. So yeah, identity and access management, you got to figure out your RBAC. Michael Levin, who's another rock star in the community, he always kind of talks about, most clusters are not secured from an RBAC perspective. In fact, that's something that folks often forget. And so RBAC is important in that identity and access management realm. You're networking, right? We talk about that a lot. And there's a reason we keep coming back to that. So, what sort of networking model are you going to adopt with your AKS cluster, your IP address ranges, your ingress controller? What are you going to use there? Because typically that comes into play. You want that. Are you going to use service mesh? Are you not? Do you care that the pods can talk to each other? Do you want to control that traffic? Are you going to have microservices there where you need to control that pod to pod communication? Or are you just running other applications where it's not that important, right? So you need to talk about that and figure that out. I think you talked about a web application firewall. So again, what are the workloads you're going to run? I would recommend deploying a private cluster if you're running your cluster in production. And there's a lot of information out there to do that and help with that in the Microsoft documentation and a lot of blogs. So don't be afraid of doing a private cluster. When you do a private cluster, you can have Azure DevOps run on your private Azure network as well. So you can still do your deployments and stuff. We did that all the time. You know, thinking about your governance, your taxonomy, your resources, that goes back to like namespaces. And also, are you going to have many clusters? Are you going to have like multiple applications co-located on a cluster or clusters? How many are you going to allow? When do you spin up a new cluster? Like, are you going to allow 10 applications per cluster? Like, you got to figure those things out, right? And then also policy enforcement. And I like to reference Azure policy, but things like if you allow people to spin up clusters, you know, make sure that they're private clusters. You can enforce that through Azure policy, and you can enforce other things too. So, you know, security, secrets management, that's critical. You don't want to be storing like your secrets in your YAML files or your pipelines or containers like Docker files or any of that, right? So you need to highly recommend use something like Key Vault. And then again, like your management and operations, right? How are you going to monitor the cluster? When you monitor it, what kind of dashboarding are you going to have? Are you going to use like what's there with Microsoft out of the box in Azure? Are you going to use more like Prometheus, Grafana? And there's stuff coming in that from that aspect as well. And then like DR of your clusters. And I know folks are like, AKS, DR, DevOps, like what? Those things don't really go together. Well, actually, you need to think about that. What happens if your cluster's in a region and the whole region goes down? Right? Like,
yeah,
that can happen. And I'm not, you know, not saying that Microsoft has outages. Let's not, right? But with any cloud provider, like regions can go down. And so if a region goes down and your cluster's down, like, what are you going to do? Spin everything up from scratch? If you are, be ready for that. But you can have clusters across multiple regions and you can just repoint pipelines and stuff, right? So you got to think about those sort of things. Those are important too. I'd argue as a must-have when you're designing your AKS architecture.
That falls back to the well-architected framework, right? I mean, have that conversation constantly as well, Steve. So you're preaching to the choir here, but like, I've got it all as code. Okay. What about DNS? What about the, you know, what about the dependencies, right? What about, you know, have you tested this? Well, no, because I've tested it in this region. It'll work. It'll work in the other region. Okay. When was the last time you did the drill? The drill?
Right.
And, you know, like you get that 1,000-yard stare, right, from the customer. Like, what happens if you have a security compromise, right? You know, that kind of stuff, right? Your persistent data, and then suddenly becomes, right, this. All I wanted to do was deploy this service to actually, here's the bigger picture, right? And it's all about the planning constantly, right?
It is, and like.
You want to get your hands dirty, you want to deploy stuff, but you've got to constantly look at that bigger picture, right? So
definitely. And you brought up persistent data. Like, it exists out there on Kubernetes clusters. Like, there are some apps that require persistent data. It's not like you will never run into that. So you need to familiarize yourself with that. You need to understand, you know, if you're running AKS or another cloud managed Kubernetes cluster, you need to understand the underlying storage that's available from that cloud provider. You need to understand what those options are. I've done some blogging about running stateful applications on Kubernetes as well. You can check that out on my blog, but that's something that comes up. There's a whole community called Data on Kubernetes. And shout out to them. They do a phenomenal job with that community. But they talk about all things data on Kubernetes. do you want to run your databases on Kubernetes? There are some folks out there that are doing that, right? And so that's another aspect. If you're going to do that, you need to become versed in persistent data on Kubernetes and stateful applications, right? Are you going to use daemon sets? Are you not going to use that? There's a whole can of worms that you can open up there as well.
It's interesting that we're now talking about DR. We just did a DR test, and one of the scenarios prescribed that we needed to fail over to another region. And I was like, yeah, but that's not how we designed it, right? Because that needs to be in there from the beginning. If you look at your Terraform state, right, your container registries, but also things like Key Vault, right? Because the Key Vaults contain the secrets that we use and the certificates for everything that we have running. And the Key Vault can fail over to another region, but then you have access and you have managed identities that have access on that Key Vault, and these are not available in the other region. And that Key Vault is read only after it fails over to that paired region, right? And you're like, well, it's there, but I cannot access it. Right? So you need to think about, and that ties into what Paco just said. What's up, Paco? Good to see you. But what do you need to think about is, of course, networking, but Key Vaults, like, okay, what happens? Storage accounts that you use and, stuff like that. But
Paco is spot on with what he's saying. Like, yeah, you need to think about your VNets in that DR region, your subnets, like, for sure. As a part of cloud foundations and even container foundations, we would always look at like the DR scenario, and we would architect what's going to go in that DR region, and then also come up with a process for running your drills. Like, you need to test it. Don't just build it, turn it on and say, oh, it's good. What happens when you fail it over in a real emergency, and like your Key Vault's read only and your whole team scramble it, and you're like, it's there, but I can't access it. Like, hair on fire.
There's nothing worse, right? When you've got every person to the pump kind of thing.
Right.
Everything's burning down around you, right? You've got directors breathing down your neck, like kind of stuff. We've all been there, right?
Right.
When is it going to be back up? I don't know. And it also comes back to that bigger conversation around, do you have the budget to fail over?
Right.
I have those conversations, right? So again, it's not just about the tech. It's about how the business, I always say, well, how much will it cost you for it not to be there?
Right.
And you've got to start right at the top, right? Before you even get into this tech stack, like, it's having those conversations, right? Because they all feed into the requirements.
Budget.
And if we're being honest here, like, most organizations don't really care about DR until something fails and they lose millions of dollars, and they're like, why did this happen? What went wrong? Like, why weren't we prepared? Right? And like, it doesn't matter until there's money on the table. And so if you're a person architecting AKS, like, put some dollar signs next to that DR line item. Like, figure out the cost. If this goes down and we're down for 2 hours, we're losing X amount of dollars from our customers. Like, this is what this is costing the company. Or like, if it's down and people are sitting there twiddling their thumbs and they can't work, how much is that costing the company, right? For every hour, for every 30 minutes, whatever, figure out the cost, because that will drive the leadership that's like speaking their language, and will drive them to actually pay attention to what you're bringing forward and to really help you think about DR ahead of time. And that brings up another thing, like cost of running Kubernetes clusters and the workloads in there, right? That's a big ask too. Like, how much is this costing us? How much are these pods costing us? How much is all this stuff that's running in this black box called Kubernetes costing us, right? And there's tools out there like KubeCost, and I think there's some other tools, but that's a common thread that I see coming up more and more. Like, I want to know what this is costing us. I have a FinOps team over here. They're tracking the cost. Maybe your organization's doing chargeback. And so that's another aspect. When you're designing, your Kubernetes clusters.
That's interesting. That happened recently as well. Like for the business case, the question was sent to me like, okay, what do we pay per customer? Right? Because we developing this multi-tenant application, every customer gets its own pod, right? Blockchain network and private blockchain network, digital ledger. But I was like, yeah, well, that's a good question because we got all these shared components, and we can house like a certain amount of pods, and so that's easy, right? You can just divide it through the amount of customers, but then we just have to add nodes to make sure that we have compute resources for these additional pods, right? And then it becomes a little bit more tricky because you're like, yeah, it's a pretty interesting equation. Like, how am I going to come up with a number that's accurate that we can work with?
Yeah.
Because the more you run, the cheaper it will become eventually.
Right. And more nodes equal more money, right? So like,
yeah.
First of all, you need to know what that's costing you. And then second of all, you can make some decisions there. Like, do we need more full-blown nodes, or can we use some of these virtual node technologies that are out there? Like with AKS, you could, when we scale, is this going to stick around for a while, or is this like a temporary burst, right? If it's temporary, well, maybe we could just use ACI and burst out onto virtual nodes. They come and they go away, right? Lower cost versus full-blown nodes adding to the cluster. But in order to like make those sorts of decisions, you need to have a handle on the cost.
Yeah. And also logging, right? At one point, 30% of our costs for every environment that we have running was logging. Okay, we looked at it, and our kube audit events were not going to a storage account, but they were going to a log analytics workspace. Oops, right? There is pretty good guidance around that. We fixed that, but but then you also have customers who may be using their application or their tenant more than others, and that will generate more application logs, and that will translate into a higher cost for logging in that month or that day, right? So it's not as stable. At one point, if you have enough data, you can create like this baseline, this average, right? Okay, we know that for after a couple of months that we pay X amount of money to keep everything up. But we also had a pod who got stuck and just kept on logging. And after a couple of days, we spotted that. And we were like, oh, okay, $3K down the drain, right? Just on logging. Right. So there are a lot of components that well, it's obvious we went through them basically, but there's so much to it. You're like, oh, wait a minute. There's always something else.
There's a ton. And like, have you guys seen the price tag of Splunk? It's not cheap, right? It's pretty,
there's memes around that, right? Like,
there's memes around that.
Our renewal come up for Splunk, and we had to go to the federal government for help, right? Kind of thing. So,
help save some of that cost. Maybe you get a bonus, buy a new car. Who knows? Help drive some of the costs down, right? Like,
yeah, but that's part of day 2 or day 3, like operations, like continuously optimizing your environment, looking at your costs, looking at everything, right? Are we still making the right decisions? Do we have CPU and memory limits in place, right? Stuff like that. How do we detect like a spike in logging because a pod is stuck somewhere in development, right?
Right.
The customer is not using it, so nobody's ringing us up like, hey, my application is not doing it. No, it wasn't development, right?
Right.
So that ties back into logging and into alerting and into observability, and and then suddenly you're down that rabbit hole, and then you just got out of the networking rabbit hole, right? So it's just like, whoa, what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff to look at there, right? Like, what do I do if my pods crash and they're in this crash loop or something, right? Like, and I'm using GitOps. Do I just continue to try to restart that? Like, what do I want the behavior to be, right? So there's a ton of things to think about in day 2 operations. Speaking of that, in the blog post that I wrote, so towards the end, because operations is kind of the third thing, Microsoft's done a good job of getting you started and things that you should look at in your day 2 operations. How are you going to handle your cluster health, your node and your pod health, right? Your container registry, because believe it or not, like if that breaks, your deployments might start failing, or they will fail. Like a big one, patching and upgrading, patching your applications, your workloads on the cluster, upgrading your clusters, right? With AKS and other managed Kubernetes services, you still need to do that. And then if things break, like, do you have a plan for troubleshooting? Do you have tooling that can help you with troubleshooting? Like, are you just shooting in the dark, or do you have some sort of tools that'll help you like get to the root cause, right? Do you have a tool that can help you identify quickly, like, oh, this is a networking issue, or this is an issue with a node, or this is an issue with the control plane, or this is an issue with the pod itself, right? There's different kind of roads you have to go down depending on what's there. And if you're spending all this time troubleshooting networking, when it's an issue with the pod itself, like you've wasted all that time. Think about all those dollars you might have wasted spending all that time going down the wrong path. And so all that stuff needs to be thought of as a part of your day 2 operations as well.
And we had Richard on Pixel Robots in a couple some episodes ago. And I'm not sure if we did that before we went live or after or during we went live. Kev, maybe you remember, but we were talking about the Kubernetes ecosystem and, the whole Christmas tree and everything that you can add and all the bells and whistles. And before you know it, you got this whole Death Star going on. And he said, well, that's a recurring thing, right? But he said, like, yeah, but if you look at it from like 5 years ago or 10 years ago with the whole virtualization, well, that's more than 10 years ago, but when virtualization became a thing, right? Instead of having these hardware servers in racks and one server equals one server, now I have this fleet of VMs that I need to manage, right? So I do need to think about patching. I do need to think about monitoring, configuration management, all the things that are basically in Kubernetes as well. It's just a different way of looking at it. Oh, wait a minute, we already did this, but different tooling and a little bit of a different approach. Now we have a higher abstraction of virtualization where we virtualize the application instead of the whole OS. But we still need to think about all these different components like configuration management, logging, monitoring, patch management, well, etc. The list goes on, but it's not that different. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should stop saying that it's so complex and difficult and just, let things be and just, help everyone to understand it and take it from there, right?
Yeah, that you bring up a really good point. And so, some folks may not want to hear this, but ITIL still applies in many cases, right?
All right, that was the show. Good luck. No.
Yeah, like end of show right here.
Cut the feed, nominee. Keep going, Steve. Keep going.
But a lot of the principles from ITIL you can bring over, and that's not saying like throw DevOps out the window or anything. Like, I prefer doing things in a DevOps way, and like I will be happy. I'll be perfectly fine if I never have to work with VMs again. Right? But there are a lot of things from ITIL that still apply that you need to think about. Like monitoring is a part of ITIL, backup, DR is a part of ITIL, right? Service management, the concept of service catalog came out of ITIL. Those things don't just go away because now we're doing DevOps, we're using Terraform, and we're doing Kubernetes, and we're doing things in a more efficient way. Things start up faster, things are modernized. It doesn't mean all of those things from the past go away, right? Chargeback, that's something that came from ITIL. Everyone's trying to wrap their heads around that now with Kubernetes. Like, how do I determine the cost and like know what things are costing me running in my clusters? And so, those concepts from ITIL are still very relevant. Maybe not all of it, but a huge amount of it is still extremely relevant. And, the skills we had yesterday still apply today. understanding DNS, right? Kevin, you brought that up. Understanding core networking, understanding subnetting with IPs, understanding, I would even argue, the OSI model, right? I'm going way back now. But understanding those things, and also understanding like operating systems, understanding Linux.
Preach,
like,
Steve, preach.
Yeah. I'm done preaching. Like,
no, but it's these are like the conversations we've had, right? With folks, the OSI model. Like, we've all done the Cisco path, right? Most of us, right? Where like somebody, a mentor of ours, has brought out the OSI diagram, right? And it's layer and all the layers and all that good stuff, and it's all fundamental. Yeah, you have to bring those things with you, right, along the journey. So
absolutely.
Yeah, we're still doing the same things as 15 years ago, but then on a different layer of abstraction, right? So
exactly. So those skills you had still apply. They're still relevant, and they will be. When we're doing like a bunch of AI stuff, and maybe we're like avatars in a metaverse on a show like this, right? Like, it doesn't mean like networking goes away. All that metaverse is powered by tech that we've been using for a long time, right? And new tech and new stuff. So
awesome.
All right. Well, I think that brings us about time. Any more questions from the community, Robin? Any more questions from you?
No, we've been, I think it was so informative that all the questions that people might had were already answered, but no, it's no questions, man. Really great conversation. I could go on for hours, basically, right?
Yeah.
I think we all have something else to attend to as well.
We'll have to meet up at a conference and continue this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe over some food or something.
Oh, that would be awesome. KubeCon 2023 here in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
You're coming.
I'm all for it. Hey, if I can get accepted to speak, I'm there.
Let's see what we can do.
Yeah. I applied this year, so didn't make it in, but I'd love to come to that. So
yeah, somewhere else. We'll make something happen, man. Thanks.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, guys, thanks for having me on. You have a really awesome show. Again, I love the trailer, like the intro video. Makes me want to go watch Terminator 2.
It does have that vibe, right? Like, it's like, you're waiting for Arnie to turn up, right, on his motorcycle, but it's it makes me feel like I'm at the cinema. That's when it comes on. I go, yeah.
It like builds the excitement. It's like, all right, here we go. This is some action.
But yeah, it's been great having you on, Steve. Where can folks find you on Twitter?
Right there on my tag right there at Bukatech, and my blog is bukatech.com. So pretty much you can find me at Bukatech on all my socials. It's the easiest way to find me. So
awesome. Well, I've definitely learned some stuff today. I don't know about you, Robin.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always really great to talk to Steve, and everything that he's doing and everything that he's done. So I'm definitely looking forward to what's to come, Steve, now that you're operating from the mothership, right? So, let's see what happens there. We will link everything that we discussed, blog post, all of that in the video description, or like the video description. So yeah, Kev, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, again, thanks for the community. Thanks for people for watching. If you like what we do, still find it interesting, right? Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget to join our Discord server as well if you want to come and join the community of other like-minded individuals, which is community.streamingclouds.io. And for that, we wish you well.
All right.
Bye.
Take care, guys. Don't be a stranger.